Jim?
Just today, incident of anti-Semitism in Toronto. The B'nai Brith has told us again that these incidents now are out of control, and anti-Semitism is the most virulent form of hate crimes in Canada. And this is not only of concern to the Jewish community, this is a concern to all Canadians. As the Prime Minister has said consistently, and as he said in a day-long symposium on anti-Semitism that was hosted this summer, Ms. Bateman, you're hearing silence. That's because you're not listening. I have spoken out against all forms of racism and anti-Semitism using all platforms. And to try to divide our community on the basis of how virulently people speak out against anti-Semitism is just the kind of hyper-partisanship that Canadians don't want. We want to act together as a community, as a society, in fighting all kinds of racism and hate crimes. And as a Jew, I'm particularly sensitive to the anti-Semitism that we see now, and grateful to organizations such as the B'nai Brith and others who call it out whenever they see it. This is not a time to divide communities, Ms. Bateman. This is a time to unite communities around the values of tolerance and fairness as we look at the examples as recently as this afternoon, and we speak with one voice. We do not seek to divide. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Now, each candidate will have 30 seconds to respond or rebut the other candidates in the same order in which they spoke, beginning with Joyce.
Thank you. Actions speak louder than words. Michael Levitt, a respected leader in the Jewish community of Toronto, had to leave the Liberal caucus in order to continue his fight against anti-Semitism. The Liberals say they support IRA and then embrace Jenica Atwin into their caucus. Talking the talk, not walking it. Only 11 days before that warm Liberal welcome, she announced that Israel was an apartheid state. And now the Liberal, Ms. Atwin, says she stands by her comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. Julia?
Just very touched by what Jim shared about some of the experiences that he's had and some of the incidences that we've heard about today. I think it takes a lot of bravery to speak out. My grandparents survived the Nazi occupation of Poland, and I'm just feeling like we still have so much work to do since that time. So thanks to everyone for all of the work that you're doing to combat this type of hatred.
And Jim?
Unfortunately, more misinformation from Ms. Bateman. Michael Levitt went to the Simon Wiesenthal Center as a career opportunity, and now we're left to believe that somehow there was a disagreement with the Liberal caucus. I was a member of that caucus. He remained a loyal member to the end. We don't need misinformation. We need facts. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. We'll now turn to question 2. COVID-19 is an issue that has affected every single Canadian over the past year and a half, and despite our progress, it's far from over. Questions are, what is your party's pandemic recovery plan? How will it help the most vulnerable people in our communities? And if elected, what will you personally do to ensure the plans are successful? And again, each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer, and we're going to begin with Julia, then Joyce.
So what we've seen through the pandemic is that the majority of COVID outbreaks and deaths among those in long-term care occurred in for-profit long-term care homes. For this reason, the NDP is committed to ending for-profit long-term care. In addition, the pandemic has really worsened the opioid crisis in Canada. In 2020 alone, drug overdoses killed 7,000 Canadians, which is 19 people per day. To end the opioid crisis, the NDP will declare a public health emergency, will commit ourselves to working with all levels of government, health experts, and Canadians to end the stigma of drug addiction and provide evidence-based addiction and mental health treatment. We are proposing a dedicated rebuilding package for the performing arts, theater, and festivals, as many of them have been severely impacted by the pandemic. Further, we believe that economic recovery from COVID-19 must further reconciliation and economic justice for Indigenous peoples. An NDP government will work with Indigenous communities to support locally driven economic development and create good jobs through public service investments. As many of you know, an issue very close to my heart is mental health. And currently, 1 in 3 Canadians will be affected by a mental illness during their lifetime, which is over 9 million people. Research suggests that this number is increasing. So, not to sound like a broken record from my intro statement, but we really do need a federal mental health care plan that provides funding and direction to provinces to be able to provide timely access to evidence-based care. New Democrats will fight for public health care and stand up to privatization, which we know will cost Canadians money and undermine our public health care system.
Thanks, Julia. Jim, please.
Howard, we chose to respond to the pandemic with unprecedented investments in Canadians, in their families, in their businesses, and in their institutions. We knew that this was going to be a tremendous strain on the capacity of individuals and businesses to make it through. So we decided very early on as a government that we would offer individuals the kind of support they would need to get through the transition period, and businesses. And I can't tell you the number of small business owners who have said to me that without the wage subsidy, they wouldn't have made it through. And now the big issue, of course, is vaccinations, mandatory vaccinations. And I would invite those on the call tonight and all Canadians to compare the positions of the parties on mandatory vaccinations. I would ask Ms. Bateman whether or not she wants to sit in a caucus where vaccinations are not mandatory. Erin O'Toole will not give us that guarantee that even his candidates will be fully vaccinated. We have launched a $1 billion COVID proof of vaccination fund that we will share with the provinces and with the territories. And we will table legislation to ensure that every business and organization that decides to require proof of vaccination from employees and customers can do so without fear of a legal challenge. We will come out of this pandemic. We will build back stronger, in part because we had a government who understood that it was necessary during a time of a public health crisis to come to the aid of citizens, businesses, and their community institutions.
Joyce.
Thanks. We have the Canada Recovery Plan that will address the impact of inflation and deficits and take care of those who got left behind in the pandemic. The Conservative Party has a recovery plan to secure the future that will help all people in our community. We will secure jobs by recovering every one of the million jobs lost during the pandemic within 1 year. And we won't be calling small business people tax cheats. We will be partnering with them. We will secure accountability by enacting a new anti-corruption law to clean up the mess in Ottawa. There are simply too many accounts of Liberal insiders doing extremely well at your expense. We will secure mental health through our Canada Mental Health Action Plan. And Dr. Riddell, thank you so much for your comments. My research showed 17 Canadians every day die from opioid addictions, and your information is 19. It clearly is a problem that we need government to act on. We will secure our country by creating a strategic stockpile of essential products and building the capacity to manufacture vaccines at home. We will secure Canada's economy by balancing the budget over the next decade. We have to do better. I will personally ensure that these programs are well understood and well utilized to the benefit of everyone in Winnipeg South Centre. Working together, Canadians can defeat COVID. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joyce. I'd like to remind our audience again to submit your questions to our candidates through our chat box at the bottom of your screen. Our team is diligently noting down your questions, and we'll ask them to our candidates immediately following the questions. And that leads us to question number 3. Canada's a strong... Oh, sorry. I just realized, I was just told by a voice right to the right of me here that I did not give you your chance for rebuttal. Yes, I knew I'd make a mistake somewhere. So why don't we do that right now? Everyone will get 30 seconds. We'll begin with Julia, then Jim, then Joyce.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, Joyce, when people are talking about, taxing the rich, they're not talking about taxing small business owners. They're talking about taxing folks who have offshore bank accounts, people who, people like Jeff Bezos, who are billionaires, who are not paying their fair share of taxes. We have more discrepancy between the very wealthy and the poor than we've ever had in Canadian society. So I think that's an important point of clarification.
Thank you, Julia. Jim?
We entered the pandemic with the best balance sheet in the G7 because we believe that we have stewarded our resources responsibly. The Conservatives are promising to balance the budget within 10 years. There are no economists who look at a decade out. They look at 5 years out maximum. To make promises a decade from now is not a responsible promise and not responsible budget management.
Thank you, Jim. Joyce?
I just want to thank Dr. Riddell for the clarification. And I wasn't talking about the NDP. I was talking about the Liberals, who very famously called all small business people tax cheats in 2017. Look, Canadians don't even know why this election has been called. The Liberal platform is a retread of old ideas that were promised in previous elections, not delivered on. Justin Trudeau called this election for his benefit, yours. We've got decisions to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. Well, I've already reminded the audience to ask their questions at the bottom of the screen. So let's turn to question 3. Canada is a strong voice at the United Nations for tolerance and peace. However, a strong anti-Israel bias permeates the United Nations and its agencies. Often this anti-Israel bias morphs into blatant anti-Semitism. Last month, a report found that dozens of teachers at United Nations Relief and Work Agency, known as UNRWA, schools condone violence and spread anti-Semitism online. Another report showed UNRWA textbooks denying Israel's existence and glorifying terror. What steps will you take to ensure that no Canadian taxpayer dollars go towards United Nations programs or agencies like UNRWA that demonize Israel and Jews? And this time, 2 minutes each. We're going to begin with Jim, then Joyce, and then Julia.
I was, Howard, deeply concerned when this information was presented to the Government of Canada, as were my colleagues, that Palestinian refugee children experiencing the stress of pandemic-related school closures were exposed to information in violation of the United Nations value of neutrality, human rights, and non-discrimination was taken very seriously. And the Minister of International Development, Karina Gould, has been unequivocal in her condemnation of these findings and stated so immediately. She did not hesitate to instruct Canadian officials to investigate the situation, to determine how it had happened, and to ensure it was never repeated. Karina Gould made it clear that Canadian officials would provide oversight, monitoring, and take corrective action. While a full investigation took place, funding from Canada was withheld until the government was satisfied the correct actions had been taken. This is very important. Canada, of course, doesn't want to have any association with any relief agency that promotes hatred, racism, or anti-Semitism, and there can be no exceptions.
Thank you, Jim. Joyce?
Well, Canada's Conservatives stand with Israel. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and Israel is our ally. Under an O'Toole government, Canada will once again fight efforts to demonize Israel at the United Nations, efforts that often cross the line into anti-Semitism. Unlike the Liberals, who have shamefully abstained from votes, or even on 2 occasions voted against Israel at the UN for their own self-interest, a principled foreign policy which supports Israel as the modern democratic society it is. Canada's Conservatives will prioritize Canadian interests and values at the United Nations, not pander to the priorities of dictators and despots. We will take action to stop the UN Human Rights Commission from unjustly and constantly singling out Israel for criticism. UNRWA's repeated violations of its neutrality are of grave concern. It is for that reason that the previous Conservative government stopped all funding to UNRWA. Unfortunately, the current Liberal government instantly resumed funding, and despite repeated violations, as noted in your question and as noted in Mr. Carr's answer, they continue to fund the agency. How many minutes did they go without funding? It has shabby and shaky governance. It should be a concern to all Canadians. A concern will mandate an audit of all positions in multilateral institutions, clearly assessing the national interest of Canada. We will also work to reform the UN Human Rights Council to prohibit gross human rights abusers from becoming members. An Erin O'Toole government will always defend Israel's right to exist, will always defend Israel's right to defend itself, and will always defend Israel's right to live in peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. Julia?
As I mentioned, my grandparents survived the Nazi occupation of Poland, so I know firsthand the effects that hatred due to religion or ethnicity have on individuals and families. In order to heal from these experiences, we need these experiences to be accurately represented in all forms of media, including textbooks. The NDP condemns any big discrimination against the Jewish community. Canadian public funds should never be used to support programs that encourage a sense of hatred against any individual or groups, including the Jewish community. While I was at McMaster University, I completed a research project in examining the stereotypical and inaccurate information contained in some of our elementary school textbooks that we use to teach about colonization across the provinces here in Canada. My research and the work of others in this area highlighted how harmful inaccurate information is and how it contributes to prejudice and discrimination. If I was sent to Ottawa to represent our riding, I will continue to be a voice that stands up against hate and advocates for textbooks to contain accurate information about all individuals and groups.
Thank you very much, Julia. We have our rebuttal now. There's 30 seconds given to each candidate in the same order in which they spoke, again, beginning with Jim, then Joyce, then Julia.
We all agree, and I think most Canadians would agree, that we should not support any organization that, as a part of its mandate or the part of its modus operandi, choose to vilify any group of people. This is unacceptable, and this is not the way we define ourselves as Canadians. We have been very effective in calling out racism and discrimination wherever we find it. And I'm very proud to be part of a community, the Jewish community. And as we started this debate a half an hour ago with the example of how we are opening up our doors to Afghan refugees, because that's who we are as Canadians, as we call out discrimination wherever we find it and however it's manifest.
Thank you, Jim. Joyce? I'll give everyone seconds.
I'm sorry, Howard?
No, I'm going to give everyone an extra 10 seconds because I was momentarily looking at something. And so you have 40 seconds.
Oh, thank you. Howard, Israel is an oasis of democracy in a desert of dictatorships. Those dictatorships have no respect for human rights and our Liberal government voted against democracy and Israel in their own self-interest. This unprincipled act was done to support Mr. Trudeau's failed attempt to obtain a UN Security Council seat. Our Liberal government chose to align Canada with despots and dictators in callous self-interest. It doesn't matter how fancy the words are, Canada, under the Liberals, has voted against Israel twice. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. Julia, again, 40 seconds.
Thank you. I've been really heartened to hear how strongly the other candidates, as well as I'm trying not to be too distracted by the comments in the chat, but this issue sounds to be just so important to so many people in our community. This, as I mentioned, the pandemic has really shown me that when there is a political will and when we do stand together, there is so much that we can do as a community and as a country. And so, if I was elected as your MP, I definitely believe that there is a lot that we could do to continue working on this important issue together.
Thank you, Julia. We're moving to question 4 and the last of the prepared questions. As the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, Iran has supplied arms personnel, training, and finances to various proxies in the Middle East and throughout the world. Much of its operations are conducted through the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which was also responsible for downing the Ukrainian passenger jet, resulting in many Canadian lives lost. The Islamic Republic of Iran has provoked and exacerbated conflicts that have resulted in mass civilian casualties, displacement, and destruction of infrastructure. The questions are, what is your party's view on Canada-Iran relations? And secondly, do you accept that the entirety of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps should be designated a terrorist entity as called for in the motion adopted by the House of Commons? Each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer in the following order: Joyce, Julia, Jim.
Well, Iran is a destabilizing influence in the world. The shooting down of PSW 752 was a deliberate act of terrorism and resulted in the deaths of many, including many Canadians. The regime has supported Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi rebellion in Yemen, and Hamas in Gaza, creating the world's worst conflict-driven humanitarian disasters. Despite this, Justin Trudeau has failed to hold the Iranian regime accountable. An Aaron O'Toole government will hold the Iranian regime accountable for its reckless nuclear ambitions, malevolent state support of international terrorism, and human rights violations. We will impose Magnitsky's sanctions on gross human rights violators. We will fulfill the motion adopted by Parliament and designate the Islamic Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist entity. Just this August, the Jewish Post reported that Mr. Carr believes his job is to support his caucus and bring their views to you. When I was your MP, I brought your views to the caucus, and that is what I will continue to do. Thank you very much. Anybody wanting more details on our Middle East policy, it's clearly documented in our Canada Recovery Plan, which you can read at conservative.ca. I think it's 83 pages. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. Julia.
The NDP strongly condemns any financial, logistical, or any other support given by the Iranian government for terrorist groups, whether in Syria, Iraq, or elsewhere. The list of terrorist entities is updated based on recommendations of the Minister of Public Safety, who is supposed to make such decisions based on comprehensive criminal and security intelligence reports. And New Democrats not want to politicize this process.
Thank you. Jim?
We have been unequivocal in the condemnation of Iran's role in the January 2020 downing of Flight PS 752, which killed all 176 civilians on board, including 55 Canadians, 30 permanent residents, and many more with strong ties to Canada. The Government of Canada's report on the incident was released in June of this year and confirms that Iranian military and civil authorities shoulder all the blame for the downing of the plane. The Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs have been very clear in their condemnation of the Iranian authorities' characterization of their actions as reckless incompetence and wanton disregard for human life. We know their official account of the incident only confirms their continued evasion of the truth and acceptance of responsibility. It remains Canada's view that Iran's report makes omissions to deliberately muddy the waters around their actions, and we believe Iran has violated their obligations under international law. Our response has been robust in calling for a full account of events leading to the disaster and demanding robust measures be taken by Iran to guarantee a tragedy like this does not happen again. Canada will also be vocal in international forums to demand that Iran be held fully accountable for its unconscionable actions. And as you all know, the clandestine arm of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Quds Force, is currently listed as a terrorist entity. And in June of 2000, the Liberal caucus voted 161 yeas, calling for the immediate designation of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a listed terrorist entity.
Thank you. Now we'll have rebuttal or response in the same order in which our three candidates spoke, beginning with Joyce, then Julia, then Jim.
Well, Canadians care deeply about this atrocity, and accountability matters. I reiterate that it is important for Mr. Carr to bring your views to his caucus rather than, as Mr. Bellin reported, I believe it was August 5th in the Jewish Post, that Mr. Carr believes his job is to support his caucus and bring their views to you. It's things like this that truly matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Julia?
As I mentioned, this is such a terrible atrocity, and the Canadian government definitely does not want to be or should not be supporting terrorism in any way. I think our party definitely stands in support with the victims of this horrible atrocity, and I'd like to support in any way I can.
Thank you. Jim?
My job is to represent the interests of the people of Winnipeg South Centre into the Government of Canada. As a member of the Government of Canada, it's my job to communicate decisions that we take as a government. For some reason, Ms. Bateman has chosen to distort that view and to turn it on its head. I spend all of my time when I'm in Winnipeg talking to the citizens of this great riding and representing their interests in Ottawa.
Thank you very much, and thank you, candidates, for answering those 4 questions. Now we're going to move to the audience questions, and this is where you might see me close up because I have to go very close to see the questions here. So I could turn my camera off, but if you don't mind, I'll just lean forward a little bit. So here's the question, and this is a question that we will ask all our candidates, even though it's framed as asking one. So I'll just maybe take out the name of the individual. So I have a question. Climate models predict that Earth's global average temperatures will rise an additional 4 degrees Celsius during the 21st century if greenhouse gas levels continue to rise. But with swift action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, models project that global average temperatures will only rise an additional 1 degree Celsius. How are we going to prevent desertification rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and food insecurity without ambitious targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the order in which, if any candidate wants me to repeat any part of that question, I will. And if not, let's begin. The order will be Julia, Jim, and Joyce.
This is a really incredible question. Thank you so much to the person who asked it. I feel deeply that climate change is the main issue facing humanity. I think this is more than a partisan issue. The NDP takes this issue quite seriously, and that's why in our platform, we have promised to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030. We've also protecting 30% of the land and oceans by 2030. I think that kind of ambitious targets for protecting fresh water, as well as reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that's the kind of targets that we need to see in order to prevent rising sea levels, to prevent the kinds of temperature increases that are predicted should we not be controlling greenhouse gases at that level. And so I think our plan to target greenhouse gas emissions. We also have a plan. I like that there was a question about food insecurity. We do have a plan to increase food security in the north, which we know. I just posted today or yesterday an article about how because of climate change, there's going to be greater food insecurity, particularly in northern and rural areas, which will be hardest hit by things like forest fires, wildfires. And we know our Canadian North already experiences food insecurity. So I think there's quite a few pieces of our platform that are specifically designed to address climate change in a meaningful way. I hope I answered that question.
Thank you. Jim?
I appreciate the question very much because it gives me a chance to reflect so much of what I'm hearing at the door and in conversations with the people of Winnipeg South Centre. And I would say, aside from the pandemic itself, it's the issue that comes up the most often, especially among the younger generation, because they understand that the pace of change has been accelerated beyond what anyone could have imagined. And that means that the response of government is far more powerfully needed now as it been before. And if you look at what the Conservative Party and Aaron O'Toole is saying, he wants to go back to the Harper numbers that were announced many years ago, not to go forward, but to go backward. Canadians know that there is no appetite to go back to targets that were announced by the Harper administration years ago. Rather, we have to become part of the international community's understanding that the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions urgently is a priority not only for Canada, but for the entire international community. And if you look at our platform, you will see that it is absolutely replete with particular actions that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that will invest in renewable sources of energy, that will put a premium on retrofits and give Canadians an opportunity to be part of this transition, which is so important now and so important particularly to young people. I invite people to compare the platforms of the parties.
Thank you. Joyce?
Thanks. When the Conservatives took over from Paul Martin in January 2006, greenhouse gas emissions for Canada were at 747 million tons. The Conservative government, under Mr. Harper, managed to drop that to 723 million tons by 2015. Under this Liberal government, emissions have increased to 730 million tons. So even with all those trips and photo ops in Paris for Mr. Trudeau, not to mention higher taxes for every Canadian, the Liberals have overseen an increase in greenhouse gas emissions failed to meet our Paris targets. By the way, Mr. Carr, you have to know that Mr. Trudeau took Mr. Harper's Paris targets and made them his own. So unless you want to disparage your leader, that's the reality. The Liberals have succeeded only in making the cost of living higher for all Canadians. We cannot have this Liberal inaction. Climate change is real. Our plan empowers people like you to make the right decisions for the environment rather than having an Ottawa knows best approach. Big government approach clearly is not working. Another example of Liberal inaction is the 1 billion trees they promised to plant in the 2019 election. They have only planted one, and that was for Mr. Trudeau's photo op. Carbon sequestration is real and it is wonderful for greenhouse gas absorption, but you actually have to plant the tree to make it work. Again, we have a government that does not achieve results. They talk a brilliant talk, but they do not walk the walk. We can do better for all Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you, candidates. Now we'll have the 30 seconds to respond or rebut the other candidates in the same order in which you spoke. So again, Julia, Jim, and Joyce.
I think in order to meaningfully tackle climate change, which is now at a level that we're just mitigating, we're not actually preventing, we really are going to have to work together across parties. It's going to take all of us. I really would like to see more collaboration, whether elected or not, as a citizen, as a professor, just as a regular, as an MP. I would really like to work with other people to prevent climate change, because I think the fighting about who did what is not getting us very far.
Thank you, Jim.
I think it's very unfortunate that so much of what we're hearing from my conservative opponent is personal and insulting. I think that the people on this call and Canadians would be far better informed and far more appreciative if we could stick to policy and leave the personal insults somewhere else.
Thank you, Joyce.
The bottom line is that the policy resulted in an increase in greenhouse gas emissions under the Liberal Trudeau government. That is serious. That is serious for my children. It's serious for your children. And it's something we have to take action on. We can't just keep talking a lovely chatter about environment. It is real. It matters. I invite you to look at the Conservative plan, Mr. Carr. Thank you. And all of you.
Thank you. We're going to our next audience question, which again, excuse me for leaning in a little bit here. The one thing that I have noticed that is missing from everyone's platform is what is your party prepared to do for senior citizens? I'm not referring to those poor individuals who are unfortunate enough to be in residences. I'm assuming referring to COVID. I'm referring to the rest of the seniors who seem to be always overlooked in campaigns. And the order of answers we'd like to have here, 2 minutes each, will be Jim, Joyce, and Julia.
I don't think that we can set aside any issue that directly impacts seniors. This happens too often, but we also neglect that the seniors are part of our community and care as much about childcare, about climate change, about Indigenous reconciliation, about the affordability of housing as anybody else, because so many seniors have children and grandchildren who are affected by these policies. We think that pension reform is very much on the table. We have enhanced the benefits of seniors who are 75 and over. We're looking at other ways to make matters more affordable, because we realize that many seniors are on fixed incomes and they are not able to keep up with the cost of living in all of its dimensions. We also learned through the pandemic unfortunately and seriously, that care for elders was not something that the country had taken seriously enough. We are now understanding the consequences of that, and our government, our party, is committed to greater investments, to enhancing the workplace in these homes for the elderly people, to work with the provinces to learn the lessons that have been taught through the pandemic. I don't think that there is any responsibility of government that ought to be more important or more sacred even than understanding the contributions that have been made by those who came before, the lessons we have learned, and to ensure that we apply those lessons in the next chapter that we will write.
Thank you, Jim. Joyce?
Well, I agree with Mr. Carr on this one. People that I'm knocking on their doors, they tell me that the cost of everything, the cost of living has increased, and they are very concerned. Inflation has now hit nearly 4%. It was 3.7 last month, 3.5 the previous. So if you're a senior on a fixed income, that is a 4% cut in income that you just had. Now, even if your union negotiated a 1% increase, which isn't out of line with some, you got a 3% pay cut. We have a prime minister who told us he doesn't care about monetary policy. And I think it's time for a prime minister who does, because monetary policy affects us all. An O'Toole government has a plan to tackle the cost of living and for getting inflation under control. Our liberal policies have allowed inflation to ramp up to over 10-year highs. And, care for elders, couldn't agree more. We need to make sure that people are facilitated in staying in their own homes. Rather, so many elders have spoken to me about not wanting to be warehoused. They want to have a few extra bells and whistles so they can maintain their own dignity in their own home. On housing, this Liberal government is making it hard for our children to buy a house. But my goodness, seniors who have worked every day of their lives are reaching the point where they want to sell their home and use it for the benefit of their retirement. It is our solemn promise that we will not be taxing home proceeds. They will remain tax-free. Liberals have spent millions figuring out how to tax it, and since 2016 have been tracking your home sales on their income tax returns. We have a better plan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this question. This is something that I also hear very much, when providing mental health care. There are so many seniors that I work with who it really contributes to their anxiety and their worries about the future, about how they're going to afford basic necessities. The NDP has a plan to meet important healthcare needs that currently cost Canadians a lot of money. Most seniors that I speak with don't have access to medications. They have to pay quite a lot for their medications, and many seniors do require, sometimes more than one medication. And so a universal dental care plan would provide quite a high level of support to many seniors and make life more affordable to them. The other thing that many seniors and the rest of us have to pay privately for is dental care. And as many people know, if you don't have insurance, which many seniors don't, dental care, it can be very expensive. And if you don't have it and you end up, having a root canal or having dental issues, it can be extremely costly and also very impactful to our health. And so the NDP is promising universal dental care, which would definitely make life more affordable to seniors. We're also thinking quite a lot about affordability in the housing market. And part of that is providing a tax on foreign investment to ensure that the housing market is more affordable to Canadians. Lastly, we are proposing a cap on cell phone and internet rates to ensure that we're not paying more than we need to be for those basic necessities that all of us need.
Thank you. Each of our candidates will now be given 30 seconds to respond in the order in which they spoke, beginning again with Jim, Joyce, and Julia.
Now that I have grandchildren, these questions mean a lot more to me than they may have before my grandchildren came. And what it underlines for me is also how vibrant so many of our seniors are. And what it means to be 65, 70, and 75 is far from what it did a generation ago. I think we also have to value the energy and the contribution of our seniors to our community and our society. We don't do a good enough job.
Thank you, Jim. Joyce?
Hear, hear. And I just want to add, we have doubled the home accessibility tax credit. Currently, per dwelling, you can spend $10,000 as a senior to make your home more accommodating to being an elder. Now it's $10,000 per person, and we also have a medical expense tax credit to make home care fully deductible and help seniors in that way. It truly matters that we support our elders. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. Julia?
The last thing I'll add is that many seniors have found that with the cost of inflation and the cost of basic necessities growing up, the Canada Pension Plan is definitely not enough to meet their basic needs. And that's why the NDP are proposing a universal basic income to ensure that no senior who has worked hard for their entire lives lives in poverty. That's something that should never be happening here in Canada. And so we have a plan to make sure that their basic needs are met through the universal basic income.
Thank you, Julia. We're now moving on to question 3. And again, excuse me for leaning in. There has not been discussion on the lack of action on Indigenous issues. Can we hear more from each of the candidates on their views on what reconciliation and progress would look like? And this time, the order will be Joyce, Julia, and Jim.
I really appreciate that question. The Conservative Party supports treaty rights and the process of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. As part of that very sincere effort, it was our Conservative government who commissioned the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it arrived just before the 2015 election. One of the aspects of the TRC that Mr. Trudeau actually acted on was the report on murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. 2 years ago, when that report was released, one of the key findings was a call upon government to ensure that government take urgent measures to ensure Indigenous women are represented in governance. What a great recommendation. Well, the Liberal government has now appointed a non-Indigenous man as the executive director of the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Secretariat. It has a staff of 20. This was an opportunity for example and to walk the walk. This is a perfect example of while this Liberal government may mean well and they talk a great line, but they fail to achieve results. As well, Justin Trudeau campaigned with great fanfare in 2015 that he would fix all boil water advisories. We still have over 50 permanent advisories, and it varies between 23 to 39 temporary ones, depending on the day. If that was happening on a street center, it would be fixed in almost no time. We need a government that does more than just talk about reconciliation, and they've been cherry picking the TRC recommendations, calls to action. A national holiday is a wonderful opportunity for reflection, but it is not going to provide Indigenous people with clean water or help provide the mental health supports to Indigenous communities. Thank you.
Julia.
I really appreciate this question. This one is particularly close to my heart because of the work that I do in community. I think this is a longer answer than we have 2 minutes for, but I'll try to be brief. We do have 94 calls to action, and many of them have not been implemented. I think we need to start there. I also think that we need to, before we can actually have meaningful reconciliation, we need to have truth telling. And we are still in our elementary schools, in our media, we are still not telling the full truth about what has happened here in Canada. I think in order to have reconciliation, we need to sometimes be uncomfortable as settlers, and we need to be willing to work really hard to make sure that every person here in Canada does have access to basic necessities and feel safe in order to confront racism. The NDP platform was recently costed, and we have proposed billions of dollars towards Indigenous truth and reconciliation. And I think that that's a really important first step. But it's going to also take more than money. It's going to take people with really open hearts, and it's going to take people doing hard work. Take a focus of really bright people working in partnership with Indigenous communities. They have a lot of skills and a lot of knowledge. And when I go into community, I'm a listener and a learner, and I can offer some of the things I know, but actually I end up learning a lot. And I think the only way forward is us really working together. And so I'd love to be a part of, or continue being a part of, that change.
Thank you. Jim?
We've come a long way, but we have a very long way to come further down the road to reconciliation. And it can only be done in partnership with the communities themselves. And we know that in Manitoba, for example, 13 out of the 15 boiled water advisories have been solved. We know that the infrastructure in these communities has come an awful long way. We know that the standards of education have improved. And we don't know this because I am giving an opinion. We know this because there are so many Indigenous leaders who have said that the Trudeau government has done more for Indigenous peoples than any government in the history of the country, but there is so much more to do. And the key to the path towards reconciliation is not only to look at the wonderful advice from Murray Sinclair and for others associated with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but to work with the leadership in the communities themselves. This is where the impetus will come from. This is where the path forward will be forged. This is where the successes will come. And I think that our government has shown, not through fancy words, not through rhetoric, but and effective investment, and to co-develop policy with Indigenous leadership that will show us the way forward, to show us a way forward in the spirit of that kind of partnership and reconciliation. We've done a lot. We have so much more to do.
Thank you, Jim. Each candidate now has 30 seconds to respond or rebut on the question dealing with Indigenous relations and policy, and in particular reconciliation. Again, we'll do this in the order in which you spoke, which is Joyce, Julia, and Jim.
Well, I think it's very important for us to realize how important this is for the well-being, not just of an Indigenous community, but of Canada writ large. Murray Sinclair delivered his report in 2015. We have had a handful of these calls to action addressed by this government. They have been in government for 6 years. This matters. We have to move forward. We have to move forward in a true spirit of reconciliation, and we have to listen to what is being said in the recommendations, such as the governance one for the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. 40 seconds. Sorry, that was my fault, for Julia and Jim.
I'm next.
Yes, please.
I think that we as Canadians have lost so much by not including Indigenous individuals at the levels that they could be included in. When I go up to Nunavut, for example, and see more about cultural parenting, I have a PhD in child psychology. And I think, wow, they know so much about parenting, and there's so much we have to learn. And I think what a loss of understanding that we have. And so I think what we have to offer is that, in Western science, we have really good trauma-informed, evidence-based mental health services. And I'd really like to be a part of offering those in partnership with Indigenous communities, combining traditional knowledge and Western treatments in partnership.
Thank you. Jim?
I've learned so much as minister and as a member of parliament from Indigenous peoples that 40 seconds doesn't really work. But if I had to boil it down to one observation, it would be respect for the land and the air and the water and our natural environment, and how sacred that relationship is between us and our environment is the principal lesson that I believe I have learned and all Canadians should learn from Indigenous peoples.
Thank you, Jim. We are now moving on to our final audience question. And the chat sort of moved on me a little bit here, so I just want to see. Sorry if you bear with me for a moment. Sorry, everyone, there's a lot of questions. So, and what's happening is it's scrolling. So I had my cursor on it and then it sort of moved on me. Okay, maybe if I could just ask the team to resend that question so it appears as the last question. We can do that. That might be faster than asking me to find that again. They're having the same problem I'm having. That's as far as it goes.
Oh.
Okay. Well, if you guys trust me to just pick one then.
Make one up, Howard.
Sure.
I'm going to make one up.
We can take it. We can take it.
Take it, right? You don't want to hear from me. You want to hear from the audience, though. Since we went through a question with seniors, there's a question here dealing with the younger generation, which is, this comment is for all the candidates. In terms of votes of the younger population, please focus on, I just jumped, okay, so I'm going to make up the rest of it because I did read it. Please focus on your party's policies with respect to the younger generation. And the order in which we'll speak here is Julia, Jim, and Joyce.
So So we definitely have students at the top of their mind. As someone who's been in school for a very long time, I myself can appreciate how expensive education is, and the NDP has committed to, instead of having loans, having non-payable grants for students, so that students don't have to work multiple jobs while trying to pay their tuition. They can instead focus on their education and get the education that they need. We're also thinking quite a lot about how to create more jobs, particularly in the green energy sector. A lot of young people want to be working in green energy. They want to be thinking about the future. They care about the environment. And so we're thinking about how to create more jobs in this industry. And as I mentioned in the past, we know that the internet is an essential service. Absolutely all students need access to the internet. And so we want to make sure that there is reliable internet in all areas, including remote and rural areas and Indigenous communities as well, and making sure that it's fast, reliable, and affordable. And so those are some of the things that we're doing to support our student population.
Thank you. Jim?
We know that the debt load is very tough to handle for so many students. That's why we have a series of measures, including no interest on these loans and a much easier way of paying it back. People have to be employed and earn a certain amount of money before they begin to pay back their student loans. But it's not just a question of debt. It's a question of employment opportunity and training and reskilling. And our platform has all kinds of important and specific ideas about working with the private sector, working with the provinces, working with apprenticeship programs, so that young people can aspire to take the job that they have been dreaming of taking. The world is different now than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago, when you could probably get a job with a bank or with a company or with an employer and stay in that job for 20, 30, 40, or 50 years even. That is not what the norm is these days. Therefore, the kind of reskilling and retraining that you need to adapt to changes in the workforce is absolutely essential. But the issue that is at top of mind for so many of the young people with whom I've had the pleasure of chatting over the last number of weeks is climate change. And they're looking at their own futures. They're looking at their own families. They're looking at a world that can sometimes be quite daunting. And those of us who have lived through even this past summer with blazing forest fires to our west, with temperatures that we could only imagine would be possible, this is the preoccupation with so many young people. That's why our platform has so many creative ideas to fight climate change.
Thank you. Joyce?
Thanks. Well, our young people, anybody who's a parent, it's all about your children, always. And the debt load that our children carry is not confined to their university costs. We are packing them full of debt to have to carry the burden of for many, many, many decades to come. We have a plan to address that and alleviate that stress. Just the other day, the Bank of Canada was very clear. It is not a question of if, it is a question of when interest rates are going up. Anybody who lived through the 1980s knows how crippling interest rates can be and will remember people leaving their keys to a home at the bank because they simply couldn't afford the renewal of the mortgage. We're headed that way with our increasing inflation. We are definitely at risk. And while we're speaking of housing, our children, our educated, capable, wonderful children, are not necessarily going to ever be able to afford a house. I mean, we want them to have what we had when we were young. The housing problem is one of supply, not demand. We have a Liberal government that is throwing buckets of money on the demand side. All they're going to do is raise the cost of housing and price more and more of our children out of that market. Conservatives know this is a problem, and we have a very clear plan to build 1 million homes. We're going to provide more Canadians with a path to home ownership with better mortgage capacity, and we're also going to ban foreign investors from buying homes unless they come to live in Canada. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we're going to give our candidates an opportunity to rebut or respond, 30 seconds each, in the same order again. Julia, Jim, and Joyce.
I'll add that today the average student with debt owes over $20,000 at the end of an undergraduate degree, and then even more for individuals who go on to graduate degrees, which is a very large amount of money, particularly for anyone who is hoping to buy a home. So the NDP party is committed to ending debt, forgiving up to $20,000 in student debt, which will help wipe out about 20% of all student debt and helping about 300,000 borrowers save money, which I think would make a huge difference for students.
Thank you, Julia. And we'll give an extra 10 seconds to Jim and then Joyce.
Student debt is a huge and growing problem. All the parties have announced in their platforms policies that will help reduce and relieve that debt. But it's about jobs, and it's about the availability of good jobs. And in order to be impactful, we have to be able to anticipate the changes in the job market due to technology, due to the pressures of climate change, so that the students who are graduating now have a much better understanding of the skills that they'll need, and to have a government that will partner with them to give them the chance to acquire those skills.
Thank you, Jim. Joyce?
And I agree with Mr. Carr again. Student debt is a serious factor. So is the debt our country is placing on every baby's shoulders. Job creation is our number one category in our recovery plan. We know how important it is to create jobs for all people, but especially for young people. And that is an intrinsic part of our plan. We also, what our children have been through, the mental health piece is crucial, because sitting alone in a room, going to university, is not what all of them signed up for. So we're being respectful of that as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joyce. I have to say how impressed I am that all the candidates have been able to answer complex questions, some of which you prepared for, some of which you didn't, and all within the time limits we've given you. So kudos to all our candidates. And that brings us, in fact, we're right on time, to the closing statements by our candidates. We're going to ask each of our candidates to make their closing statements, 2 minutes per statement. And they've been selected, the order in which they're going to speak has been selected at random. And it came up Julia Riddell, Jim Carr, Joyce Bateman. So Dr. Riddell.
Thank you so much for joining us here today as we think about these important issues. What I've heard from people in our riding as I'm out knocking on doors every day after work and on the weekends, because I still work full time, is that they want the culture of politics to change. They want leaders to work together instead of mudslinging and tearing each other down. And the people that I talk to are telling me that they're ready for change. They are very concerned about the climate crisis, and they want a government that's going to commit to ambitious emissions reductions and then actually follow through on those commitments. The NDP have committed, as I mentioned, to protecting 30% of our land, freshwater, and oceans by 2030, and promising to fulfill Canada's G20 commitment to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and redirect those funds to low carbon initiatives. We'll also improve the National Building Code to ensure that by 2025, every new building in Canada is built net zero. We'll do this because we can't afford not to. The issues that we're facing, the issues that we've talked about here today, including the climate crisis, poverty, homelessness, Indigenous reconciliation are bigger than any one political party. I believe that it's time for social justice and collaborative action. And I know that we can make life more affordable for seniors, students, and everyone in need of support. I believe that housing, access to clean water, and nutritious food are human rights. In a country as wealthy as Canada, there is no excuse to leave any Canadian living in poverty or without a safe roof over their head. I would be honored to represent our community in Ottawa, and I promise to do everything in my power to follow through on the commitments that I've made today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Riddell. Mr. Carr?
Public service is a responsibility, and it's also an opportunity to serve the people with whom you share community, you share services. And for me, as I look back on the possibilities, and as I look upon my own career as a member of parliament and as a minister, it would be very hard to pinpoint one moment, but in front of an audience that's hosted by the B'nai Brith, I think maybe I can. And that's when we signed the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement. And I was the minister responsible to shepherd it through Parliament. And I knew that this was a way beyond any other where we could bring the people of Canada and Israel closer together in signing a progressive treaty and agreement that really has become the envy of much of the world. And it's because of the impact it has on people. Treaties themselves might make good reading, but it's the impact they have on our capacity to earn a living, to relate to those in a part of the world with whom we have so much in common. And as somebody of Jewish background who has suffered personally from anti-Semitism, who has had a lifelong love affair with the state of Israel, to have been the minister for Canada signing that trade agreement was a very special moment. But if there were moments that are more special than that, they're the ones when we, as members of parliament, actually make an argument for these individuals as they try to navigate what can be the labyrinthian halls of the government of Canada. And every time that we are able to make one life better, we have earned our pay. For that, I'm most satisfied of all. And thank you, B'nai Brith, for hosting the stimulating debate tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. Ms. Bateman?
Every election, every politician will tell you this is the most important election of our lifetime. This time, however, I really think it might be. The COVID crisis has put us on the cusp of a fundamental reorientation of our society, both here in Canada and to our place in the world. Justin Trudeau's Liberal government's track record does not give me confidence that he will get it right. From increased cost of living, creating real pain in many people's lives, to broken promises on reconciliation, to our disastrous performance on the world stage in Afghanistan and China, to a legacy of debt and wasted billions on interest payments. We need to do better for the sake of all Canadians. I've always said the only reason to enter public service is to make people's lives better. And that has guided my past work, both in politics and in our community. Erin O'Toole's Conservative Party has a plan to secure our economic future, to make life more affordable, to protect our environment, and to support the Canadians who need our support most. It is a plan to make Canada more prosperous and more just for all. It is a plan to achieve results for all Canadians. On September 20th, I hope you vote for me, Joyce Bateman. But what I wish more than anything is that you vote. Our democracy is precious and it needs to be nurtured. thank you so much for participating tonight. It has been my absolute pleasure to be a part of this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to our candidates, Julia Riddell, Jim Carr, Joyce Bateman. If I had a hat, it would be off to you. It's just a wonderful job tonight. I want to thank you so much for your participation in the event, for taking the time to clarify your party's positions on the many issues that we discussed this evening. We wish you much success in your campaigns. We want to thank Congregation Sherazadic and the Herzliya Congregation for partnering with B'nai Brith in this event. I'd like to thank the national team back in Toronto, led by Michael Mostyn, and of course our technical team, who I consulted with on the weekend just to make sure that we would get through this without any problems, and they were true to their word. Special thanks to Dr. Ruth Ashrafi, who's here with me off to the side here, the new head of B'nai Brith in Manitoba, for all your hard work in making this debate a reality. Most of all, to members of the audience, thank you for your participation, for submitting your questions to the candidates. I'd like to make a recommendation actually to B'nai Brith that, if possible, all of the questions be forwarded to the candidates. So even whether they want to answer them or not, I would just suggest that at least they see the issues that our audience is interested in, the ones we couldn't get to this evening. And on behalf of B'nai Brith and all of us, I wish everyone here a good evening. And remember, exercise your precious franchise and vote in this year's election. Thank you all.
Thank you so
Good
much.
night, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you so much, Howard.